Do you find your grocery bills quite steep? Imagine the challenges faced by workers in the Wild West, who subsisted on whatever they could hunt, gather, or transport in their wagons. These 15 economical meals, while not elaborate, sustained generations through droughts, conflicts, and relentless labor. At the forefront of this culinary list were beans with salt pork. Have you ever encountered a food item that appeared at every single meal? That's essentially what beans represented to Wild West laborers, yet they genuinely relished them. This famous pairing was the ultimate sustenance on the American frontier, continuously simmering over campfires, acting as the most dependable dinner imaginable. Beans with salt pork weren't merely one type of food, they were primary sustenance, the foundation of frontier nutrition and the original set-it-and-forget-it dish. Unlike our modern fast meals that vanish after one serving, beans embodied a deliberate lifestyle, a pragmatic solution to the stark realities of life on the range, in mining camps, and during cattle drives. At their core, beans were simply dried legumes that remained edible for months without refrigeration. What went into the bean pot? The basis typically comprised pinto beans, navy beans, or the most affordable variety available at the trading post, boiled until tender, then seasoned with a small piece of salt pork. A study of frontier camp remnants indicated that the average cowboy consumed beans at least twice daily, equating to over 700 bean meals annually. During cattle drives, chuck wagon cooks kept their bean pots continuously simmering for days, replenishing water and beans as the crew consumed their fill. The inclusion of salt pork made a significant difference. This was not the bacon we recognize today. Salt pork was fatty pork belly, preserved in heavy salt and packed in barrels, capable of enduring months on the trail. A single 2-inch cube could flavor an entire pot of beans, supplying crucial fat and salt that hard-working men desperately needed. The preparation method was remarkably straightforward. Dried beans were soaked overnight. In the morning, they were drained. Fresh water was added, a chunk of salt pork tossed in, and the pot placed near the fire. It would then simmer all day while they worked, with dinner ready by evening. Some chuck wagon cooks became renowned for their bean recipes. A pinch of wild sage, some foraged wild onions, or a dash of molasses could transform basic beans into something men eagerly anticipated. The drawback was that frontier camps were notoriously odorous places. An old saying suggested you could determine wind direction by listening to the cowboys' complaints. Nevertheless, beans with salt pork kept the West thriving. Railroad workers, gold miners, cattle drivers, and homesteaders all relied on this humble combination. While beans formed the backbone of frontier meals, they weren't the sole sustenance that sustained workers. Another staple appeared at almost every meal, although calling it food might be an exaggeration. Could something be both indestructible and barely edible? Hardtack proved the answer was yes. These rock-hard biscuits acquired nicknames such as tooth dullers, sheet iron, and worm castles. Hardtack was brutally simple. Flour, water, and salt mixed into a stiff dough, rolled flat, cut into squares, and baked until all moisture evaporated. The result was a cracker so hard it could last for years without spoiling. Its hardness wasn't a flaw, it was its essence. Without refrigeration, most foods spoiled within days, but hardtack lasted indefinitely. Supply wagons transported barrels that could be months or even years old. Eating hardtack required strategy. Biting directly into one risked cracking a tooth. Most men softened hardtack by soaking it in coffee, water, or bean juice until it was chewable. Some fried it in bacon grease, while others crumbled it into stews. Coffee became hardtack's indispensable companion. Strong, bitter frontier coffee served multiple purposes. It awoke you, warmed you, and, most importantly, softened your hardtack. Cowboys and miners consumed coffee in quantities that would alarm modern doctors. Frontier coffee bore little resemblance to today's carefully prepared brews. Chuck wagon cooks made it by boiling water, adding ground coffee beans, and letting it steep until it was as black as tar. One cowboy claimed good trail coffee should be strong enough to float a horseshoe. The combination of hardtack and coffee became a frontier ritual. Mornings began with coffee and hardtack, dipped until edible. Midday breaks featured more of the same. Hardtack had one notorious issue: weevils. These small beetles laid eggs in flour, and their larvae thrived in stored hardtack. Hungry men learned to tap their hardtack against a table, dislodging the weevils before eating. In desperate times, they wouldn't even bother, jokingly calling it extra protein. Despite its many flaws, hardtack saved lives. When supply lines failed, when hunting yielded nothing, when every other food source vanished, hardtack remained. While hardtack kept men alive, it didn't keep them happy. When flour was fresh and a cook had time, something far superior appeared on frontier tables. Sourdough flapjacks were the closest thing to luxury most frontier workers ever tasted. These pancakes required just 3 ingredients: sourdough starter, flour, and water. Sourdough starter was liquid gold on the frontier. This bubbling mixture of flour, water, and wild yeast could live indefinitely if fed regularly. Miners carried starter in pouches close to their bodies to keep it warm, and chuck wagon cooks guarded their starter like treasure. The beauty of sourdough was its self-sufficiency. Unlike modern baking that relies on store-bought yeast, sourdough captured wild yeast from the air. Once established, a starter could last decades. Making flapjacks was simple. Mix sourdough starter with flour and water until you get a pourable batter. Heat a greased pan over the fire, pour circles of batter, and flip when bubbles appeared. The taste was distinctly tangy, unlike modern pancakes, but after days of beans and hardtack, sourdough flapjacks tasted like heaven. Men ate them plain or, if fortunate, with a drizzle of molasses. Flapjacks provided crucial variety in the monotonous frontier diet. Sunday mornings often featured flapjacks, giving workers something to anticipate after 6 days of hard labor. Mining camps and cattle drives developed hierarchies around sourdough quality. A cook renowned for excellent flapjacks could command higher wages. Men would switch employers for better breakfast. Flapjacks required relatively fresh flour, but another grain-based meal could be prepared from even the cheapest, coarsest ingredients available. Cornmeal mush was exactly what it sounds like. Boiled cornmeal and water cooked until thick, eaten hot or cold. It wasn't exciting, but it was cheap, filling, and required almost no skill to prepare. Cornmeal cost less than wheat flour and grew in conditions where wheat failed. A single bag of cornmeal could feed a man for weeks if stretched properly. The basic recipe couldn't be simpler. Boil water, slowly stir in cornmeal while whisking to prevent lumps, and cook until thick. Hot mush was breakfast food. Workers ate it plain, with a splash of milk if available, or with molasses if they were lucky. Cold mush had a second life. Once cooled and solidified, It could be sliced and fried. These fried mush slices became a side dish for other meals, or portable food that workers could carry into the fields. Cornmeal mush stretched further than almost any other food. A single cup of dry cornmeal cooked with water expanded to feed multiple people. During economic depressions and crop failures, mush kept families alive when nothing else was available. The nutritional value was limited. People who ate primarily cornmeal developed pellagra, a disease caused by niacin deficiency. Thousands of poor Southerners suffered from pellagra in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Despite its limitations, cornmeal mush remained a frontier staple. It was reliable, cheap, and required minimal cooking equipment. When even basic ingredients like cornmeal ran low, frontier workers resorted to true scrap cooking, utilizing every bit of food that might otherwise be discarded. Scrap stew was the ultimate waste-nothing meal. Bones with bits of meat still attached, vegetable peels, stale bread crusts, bacon grease, anything remotely edible went into the pot. Frontier life left no room for waste. When food was scarce and money scarcer, throwing away anything edible was unthinkable. The cooking method was simple. Keep a pot simmering near the fire constantly. Toss in scraps throughout the day, bones from yesterday's meal, potato peels, the tough outer leaves of cabbage. By evening, you had something resembling soup. Bones played a starring role. After eating meat, frontier workers saved every bone. These bones went into the stew pot, where they simmered for hours, releasing marrow and any remaining meat scraps. Some bones were used multiple times, boiled until they literally fell apart. Stale bread found new life in scrap stew, hardtack too old even for dunking, bread gone mouldy on the edges, biscuits dried to rocks. All of it went into the pot, where moisture softened it back to edibility. Mining camps and railroad construction sites often had communal scrap pots. Workers contributed whatever they had, and everyone ate from the shared pot. When actual vegetables were available, even inexpensive ones, frontier meals improved dramatically. Potatoes and onions were the working man's vegetables. Both grew easily, stored well, and cost little. Together they made a stew that was simple, filling, and actually tasted like something. Potatoes thrived in frontier conditions. They grew in poor soil, produced heavy yields, and could be stored in root cellars for months. The stew recipe was straightforward. They chopped potatoes and onions, brought water to a boil until the potatoes softened, and then, if available, seasoned it with salt. Enhancements included a touch of bacon grease for richness, or wild herbs for diverse flavors. The outcome was a thick, nourishing stew that truly satisfied hunger. Unlike watery broths or bland gruel, potato and onion stew offered substantial sustenance. Frontier laborers frequently consumed this stew, especially in winter when other vegetables were scarce. It graced tables from the mining camps of Montana to the ranches of Texas. Potatoes supplied vital calories. Men engaged in strenuous work could easily devour 5 or 6 potatoes in a single meal, providing over 600 calories from the potatoes alone. While fresh vegetables were essential for potato and onion stew, another frontier staple could be prepared from non-perishable ingredients. Sourdough bread was the lifeblood of the frontier. Unlike flapjacks, which were a breakfast delight, sourdough bread was a serious dietary component. It accompanied every meal, soaked up stews, and could be eaten on its own when no other food was at hand. Frontier ovens varied greatly. Chuck wagons were equipped with built-in Dutch ovens. Mining communities might share a communal stone oven. Some workers possessed nothing more than a covered pot buried in hot coals. The bread itself was dense and chewy. Frontier bread was designed to be filling and last for several days. A single loaf might be consumed over 3 or 4 days, gradually hardening but remaining edible if dipped in coffee or stew. Workers consumed immense quantities of bread. A man performing arduous physical labor might eat a pound or more of bread daily. Bread constituted the majority of daily caloric intake for most frontier workers. Bread also functioned as a plate. Thick slices could hold stew, beans, or other moist foods. After finishing the topping, one would eat the bread that had absorbed all the juices. While plain sourdough bread was common, adding one simple ingredient transformed it into something extraordinary. Cornbread with molasses was the frontier's equivalent of dessert. The cornbread itself was straightforward and economical. The molasses provided a sweetness that made difficult lives a bit more tolerable. Cornbread required only cornmeal, water, a touch of fat, and salt. Mixed together and baked in a hot pan, it yielded a dense, crumbly bread. Unlike wheat bread, cornbread needed no rising time. Simply mix and bake. Molasses was the magical component. This thick, dark syrup was a byproduct of sugar refining, making it considerably cheaper than actual sugar. A jug of molasses could last for months and offered the only sweetness many frontier workers ever experienced. Drizzling molasses over warm cornbread created a simple but gratifying treat. The sweetness contrasted with the corn's natural flavor. Workers enjoyed cornbread with molasses as a special breakfast or as an evening indulgence after a demanding day. Children in particular cherished this humble treat. In families where candy and sweets were unheard of luxuries, cornbread with molasses was the week's highlight. When meat was available, even in small quantities, frontier cooks devised methods to extend its use as much as possible. Jerky stew transformed a few strips of dried meat into a meal capable of feeding several individuals. Jerky was costly, but a modest amount when prepared correctly. Jerky was meat's answer to hardtack. Thin strips of beef, venison, or other meats were heavily salted and dried in the sun or over smoke. The result was a leathery, nearly indestructible food that could endure for months. Eating jerky straight was challenging. It was tough, salty, and demanded significant chewing. However, rehydrated in stew, jerky softened and infused its flavor into the cooking liquid. The stew preparation was simple. Break jerky into small pieces, add water, and let it soak for an hour. Then incorporate any available vegetables and simmer until everything was tender. A few ounces of jerky could flavor a pot large enough to nourish 4 or 5 men. This efficiency made jerky stew a practical way to add meat to the diet without the expense of fresh meat. Hunters and trappers made their own jerky from game animals. Deer, elk, antelope, even bear could be processed into jerky. This homemade jerky cost nothing but time and effort. When workers had the time and opportunity, they could supplement their basic rations with foods gathered from the land itself. Foraged stew combined whatever could be hunted or collected with any existing staples. Rabbit, wild onions, berries, and anything else edible found its way into the pot. Small game was ubiquitous on the frontier. Rabbits, squirrels, prairie dogs, and birds could be caught with simple traps or shot with a rifle. Rabbit was the most common foraged meat. A single rabbit provided enough meat for a small pot of stew. The meat was lean and mild, absorbing whatever flavors it was cooked with. Wild onions grew throughout the frontier. They were smaller and more pungent than cultivated onions, but freely available. Workers learned to recognize their distinctive smell and appearance. Berries added both flavor and nutritional value to forage stews. While we view berries as sweet treats, frontier cooks often incorporated them into savory stews, where their tartness balanced rich meat flavors. Wild greens were plentiful in spring and summer: dandelion leaves, lamb's quarters, purslane, and dozens of other plants offered free vegetables. Workers learned which plants were edible and which were poisonous. Foraged stew required knowledge and effort, but no monetary cost. For workers who were penniless but had time, foraging provided genuine food security. When fresh meat was unavailable, another preserved option offered protein for those who could afford it. Dried salt beef was a step up from jerky. Chunks of beef were heavily salted and dried, creating a preserved meat that could last for months in a barrel or sack. The pieces were larger and thicker than jerky. A chunk of salt beef the size of one's fist could add substantial meat to a pot of stew. Like jerky, salt beef necessitated rehydration before consumption. The meat was soaked in water to remove some of the salt, then boiled until tender. This process took hours, but the result was actual meat. Salt beef was more expensive than jerky. Workers purchased it when they could afford it, usually after payday. It was a treat, not an everyday food. Chuck wagon cooks on cattle drives often had barrels of salt beef. They used it to add protein to the crew's meals, understanding that men performing exhausting work required substantial food. For workers constantly on the move, portable food that didn't demand cooking was essential. Cowboy trail mix was not the granola and chocolate version known today. It was a practical combination of dried foods that could be consumed while riding, working, or traveling. Jerky, hardtack pieces, dried fruit when available, and sometimes nuts. The concept was straightforward. Combine foods that wouldn't spoil, didn't need cooking, and provided quick energy. Workers carried trail mix in saddlebags, pockets, or small pouches. Cowboys on lengthy cattle drives relied heavily on trail mix. When riding for 14 hours straight, there was no time for a sit-down meal. Grabbing a handful from a saddlebag kept one going. Trail mix also served as emergency rations. If separated from the crew, lost in unfamiliar territory, or stranded by weather, the trail mix in one's pocket might be the only thing ensuring survival. When even basic ingredients were available, frontier cooks could create simple breads that required minimal equipment. Fry bread was quick, uncomplicated, and needed only a pan and some fat. Flour, water, salt, and a bit of fat mixed into a dough, flattened and fried until golden. The cooking method was faster than baking. Heat fat in a pan, flatten a piece of dough, and fry it for a few minutes on each side. Within 10 minutes, fresh bread was ready. Fried bread was best eaten immediately while still warm. The crispy exterior and soft interior made it more appealing than plain baked bread. It could be eaten plain, used to scoop up beans or stew, or topped with molasses. The fat used for frying varied. Bacon grease was common and added flavor. The fat was often reused multiple times, absorbing flavors from everything cooked in it. When flour ran low and proper bread became impossible, frontier workers resorted to an even more primitive option. Ash cakes were the final defense against starvation. Mix whatever ground meal was available with water, flatten it, and cook it directly in the hot ashes of a fire. No pan, no oven, just fire in desperation. The cooking method was primitive but effective. Rake hot coals to the side. Place the flattened dough directly on the hot ashes. Cover it with more hot ashes and wait. After 10 to 15 minutes, brush off the ashes and bread was ready. The taste was smoky, often bitter, and frequently gritty with actual ash, but they provided calories when nothing else was available. Ash cakes could be made from any ground grain. Cornmeal was common. Wheat flour, if available, even ground acorns or other foraged foods, could be turned into ash cakes during truly desperate times. Frontier workers made ash cakes when traveling light and unable to carry cooking equipment. Prospectors heading into the mountains with minimal gear relied on ash cakes. Despite their many drawbacks, ash cakes saved lives. When supply lines failed, when hunting yielded nothing, when every other option was exhausted, ash cakes remained a possibility. The final meal on our list wasn't truly a meal at all, but rather a philosophy of frontier eating. The chuck wagon leftovers meal was whatever remained from previous meals, mixed together and served as something new. Yesterday's beans, this morning's biscuits, last night's stew, all combined into a dish that was different every time. This approach wasn't idleness, it was practical ingenuity. On the frontier, wasting food was unimaginable. Every scrap held value. Chuck wagon chefs were repurposing food remnants. Old biscuits found new life, crumbled into stews as a thickening agent. Unfinished beans were rejuvenated by frying them with onions. Stale cornbread was reinvigorated with fresh additions. Laborers seldom voiced discontent regarding meals made from earlier preparations, comprehending the harsh realities of life on the frontier. Provisions were highly prized. Cooks capable of maximizing resources and minimizing spoilage were indispensable members of any team. This ethos of utilizing remnants wasn't confined to combining edibles. Cooking liquids were conserved and reapplied, and bacon drippings were collected for future frying. Some of the most delectable frontier dishes emerged from inventive blends of leftovers. A proficient culinary artist could take 3 days of unremarkable fare and transmute it into a genuinely palatable experience. The chuck wagon leftover meal embodied the quintessential frontier principle: waste nothing, utilize everything, and make it functional. These 15 economical meals were instrumental in developing the American West. From beans and hardtack to wild stews and creative leftover fusions, frontier workers subsisted on simple and utilitarian sustenance. These modest provisions fueled extraordinary human accomplishments.